From New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire, you're listening to Check This Out, a new literary series where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. I'm your host, Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. I am thrilled to be able to share these conversations with you over the next few weeks. Later in the series, we'll be hearing from Zibby Owens about her debut novel, Blank. But today on the show, my guest is Jennifer Croft. She's the author of the new novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. This debut novel is about 8 translators who gather together in Poland to translate the newest book by a world-renowned author. Each translates a different language, Spanish, Serbian, English, etc., and they've been handpicked by the author. They've worked for her before, and they have a ritual of coming together at the author's house on the edge of a primeval forest to translate all at once, each working in their respective languages. This time, something's different. The author's with them on the first day, but then she goes missing. Dun, dun, dun. The real-life author, Jennifer Croft, the woman who actually wrote this book, is a very famous translator herself. And this novel gave me all sorts of insights into her work and field because it's a novel about translation and translators by a translator. It's a little bit meta, but it's very fun, very powerful, and kept me thinking for a long time after I put this book down. What is translation? And how do translations work? Those were the questions I could not stop asking. That's why I really wanted to have Jennifer on the show with us today. Jennifer, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Check This Out.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so excited to hear that you're thinking about translators.
All the time, ever since I read your book, I just
Yay!
really, yes, yay. All right, to get us started, Jennifer, can you read for us? I'd just love for our listeners to hear your voice and hear a little bit from The Extinction of Irena Rey.
Sure, I would love to. I'll just read the first 2 paragraphs. Chapter 1. We worshipped our author, and when she sent us an email telling us her masterpiece was done, we canceled our plans and packed our bags and flew from our cities to Warsaw, where, bedraggled and ecstatic, we took the train into town and boarded the bus for Białowieża. It was our 7th pilgrimage to the village at the edge of the primeval forest where she lived. She had always lived there, 5 miles from the Belarusian border. She loved that forest as much as we loved her books, which, without a fraction of a second's hesitation, we would have laid down our lives to defend. We treated her every word as sacred, even though our whole task was to replace her every word.
So beautiful. Thank you. And throws us right into this meta situation of translators on translation in a translation. Let's dive into my questions. So I just want to tell our listeners a little bit about your work as a translator. You are an American translator. You work from Polish, Ukrainian, and Argentine Spanish. And you've won all kinds of awards, including the 2018 Man Booker International Prize for her translation of Olga Tokarczuk's book, Flights. Meaning Jennifer Croft, our guest today, actually translates for a Polish Nobel laureate. Wow. I cannot wait to jump in and start asking you about this. So, Jennifer, your book, The Extinction of Irena Rey, is a book by a translator about a translator. And in fact, it's set up as a translation of a book. So many, many, many levels. Why were you compelled to write your debut fiction about translation?
I think I've really been wanting to kind of bring the spotlight to translators and the activity of translation, which I think is really fascinating and kind of unresolvable. Like, the activity of translation is paradoxical because your goal is to create something totally new that's also exactly the same as before, if that makes sense. So, you're trying to bring a text that you really love in the original language to a completely new audience in a completely different language, which sounds impossible. And it kind of is impossible. And yet it happens all the time, every day. So I've just been wanting in the last few years to kind of get readers to pay attention to the people who are doing that impossible work of translation. And I decided it wasn't enough to dramatize all of that, and especially the relationships between the translators once you take their author away from them and they lose that center of gravity. So I wanted to really emphasize the power of translation by making my novel into a translation itself, a fictional translation.
Yeah. So I want to go back to this notion you said that translation is unresolvable, because I think on a basic level, sometimes we're taught translation, translate one word for the other, that there's a one for one correspondence. But perhaps you're suggesting that's not how it works.
Well, definitely not. And you can see that by looking at the proliferating translations of something like the Odyssey. Like we have Emily Wilson's new translation of various classics. And that always brings up all of the old translations when a new one comes out and people compare them. And I think that's such a fruitful thing to do because there's so much kind of life and activity in between the translations where you can see all the options that people didn't choose, all the options that people did choose. So there's never one correct answer, I don't think, when you're translating a word or a sentence or whatever. There are always options.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's the author's original voice, and then there's the translator's voice, right, in a book. So how do you think of those two?
Yeah, I think that's really important. And that's another reason why I've been campaigning to bring attention to translators, because I think there was this notion that the best thing a translator could do would be to disappear into the novel that they're translating or whatever, and you only would receive the author's voice. But that isn't possible, in my opinion, because translators are human beings. We do have voices. We do have our own subjectivities and politics and identities. And there's no way to just like completely tamp those down as we're working. So I think the ideal scenario is that we get into a harmony with the author's voice and we create something really beautiful that gains in translation, but that is different from the original text.
So you're sort of, I think I've read an interview with you earlier where you said, in a sense, you are rewriting the whole book again.
Yeah, I definitely feel that way. Also, if you think about it, different languages have different structures as well as different lexicons. So you really do have to take apart sentence by sentence and then assemble a new thing, trying to channel the essence or the spirit or whatever kind of mystical thing you're going for of the original text or of the original author. But yeah, you have to build a new thing.
So you said that different languages have different lexicons, and so I wanted to use that as a segue into asking you about the fact that you only translate Argentine Spanish, right? Not just all Spanish. So can you talk about, like, is that what you're trying to get at?
Yeah, I mean, so that has to do with the fact that I grew up monolingual in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I studied really hard. I learned Russian first, and then I moved to Poland, and I realized very early on that in order to feel comfortable translating from another language, I kind of needed to live in the place where my literature was coming from. So that has to do also with just capturing the rhythms of a text. You kind of need to know how people interact on a daily basis, which you can't get from a dictionary or from a textbook or even from the internet. You need to go to the grocery store and you need to be at the bus stop and all of that. I think that's really essential if you didn't grow up with that language at home, and maybe even if you did. So I lived in Argentina for 7 years. I'm hoping to get to go back and live there with my family. It's a really important place to me. I absolutely love the city of Buenos Aires, and I just haven't lived in any other Spanish speaking place. So I just don't feel like I can fully understand especially the conversational Spanish of, say, Mexico or whatever specific part of Mexico, because I just haven't lived there.
It is mind-blowing that you grew up monolingual, speaking one language in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and then you took on this incredible career and rose up to such heights, right? Really learning these languages. So you mentioned you started with Russian. What inspired you to learn these languages?
I think that probably it goes back. My father was a professor of geography, and instead of like reading us stories, my sister and me, when we were little, he would sit with us and show us maps and atlases, and I think we just were very excited about, we didn't get to travel very much when I was a kid, but we got to kind of imagine what other countries might be like. And we got to see those really exciting sounding names. And I was very captivated by the Cyrillic alphabet when I was a kid. So I think honestly, the alphabet when I was a child motivated me to start studying Russian. I was homeschooled because my sister had a very serious medical condition. So my parents kept us both at home, which gave me the freedom to just do whatever I wanted. And what I wanted to do was start learning a language with an eye toward eventually traveling to the place.
What do you mean you were captivated by the Cyrillic alphabet?
I think I was just amazed that there was another way of creating symbols. I mean, just the fact that we have these symbols is so fascinating if you take a step back from it. Like we take it for granted, obviously, but just these seemingly totally arbitrary lines on a page generate some kind of image for you or some kind of feeling or whatever. And so I think maybe seeing the different symbols, which are slightly different, so I could still recognize them as letters, just held my attention because it made me think about that fact that these are kind of random things that we assign to real, like to a cat or a dog, which is my own children's current level of interest in language.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jennifer Croft, and you're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Jennifer's debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey, and translation. Jennifer, I want to segue into talking about the book itself, The Extinction of Irena Rey, which is a book about translators for translators. We're thinking about translation a lot today here on the show. And in the book, the big plot point is that the main translator goes missing. One of the big themes in the book is being lost. So while the translator is actually physically lost, they don't know where she is, the translators that are there to translate her most recent book seem sort of adrift without her. Maybe like they're a little bit lost, not sure what they should be doing without her. So there's this theme of loss. And I wanted to ask you what that means for the book.
Yeah, so I wanted to just honestly get rid of the author that they worship so much as soon as possible. So she had to leave. Her disappearance is very troubling to them because they've been working with her for such a long time, and they really believe that she is like a once in a lifetime artist. She's a genius. Her work can really change the world, and they can help her do that. And so they feel a sense of mission. And then you take her away, and everything that they've done in the past at these translation summits where they all get together to work on a book, to work on the same book under her guidance, everything that has been a tradition for them just kind of collapses or also disappears. So I wanted to, yeah, think about maybe more than them being lost or adrift. I wanted to just kind of put them in this very particular setting, which is the primeval forest, the last remaining original forest in Europe on the border between Poland and Belarus, and let them go wild. So maybe like lost in a positive sense, like they no longer have that direction, so they can just tap into their animal instincts or their fungal instincts because there are a lot of mushrooms in the book. And yeah, just kind of explore who they are and who they are to each other without her there.
Let's follow up on that mushrooms in the book. There are a lot of them. Talk to us about the mushrooms.
Well, so the original title for this book was Amadou, which refers to the product of a very special, I think, fungus called Fomus fomentarius that was used for millennia by human beings to start fires before we had matches in the 19th century. People would carry this fungus around and it catches sparks really easily. It smolders, and so people were able to cook and to warm themselves thanks to this mushroom. And since then, it's been kind of completely forgotten, except for the fact that scientists and researchers are now bringing it back to potentially replace certain kinds of construction materials and certain kinds of plastics. And so I just, for various reasons, also having to do with the way that the fungus grows in the forest, I felt like this had a lot to do with translation, and it also just kind of fascinated me that there was this previously ubiquitous thing that was so powerful that nearly went extinct, is largely forgotten, but maybe making this really important comeback.
Yeah, so the mushrooms are coming back, and you show us that in the book, and I think this leads to another one of your big themes of transformation and change, and I just wanted to sort of throw that word out to you. I was so excited because I feel like so many things are transforming. Can you talk to me about that theme of transformation in the book?
Yeah, and continuing to talk about this fungus, Fomus fomentarius, it starts its life as a parasite on a tree and it kills its host tree. And then once the host tree is dead, it becomes a decomposer. So initially, it does something that we would think of as bad in our human terms, but then it does something essential and enriching, which is kind of create new, nourishing soil for the entire forest ecosystem. And I love that idea that it transforms in its essence and identity, also could be applied to the process of translation. Like initially, there's some erasure, maybe a darker side to translation, but I also feel like it's absolutely necessary to the cultural ecosystem and enriching to provide these other cultural aspects and access points. So there's that model of transformation. Obviously, translation is always transformation. We are always aiding in the metamorphosis of a text, almost like a doula of the new book. Also, of course, like their relationships, the translators' relationships with one another are constantly changing and fluctuating once they're abandoned in Irena Rey's very spooky and weird house.
Just hearing you talk about translation and this book and the forest, I feel like there's a mirror between the two, that they, for you, they are both living things, translation and the forest. And you are trying to bring that forward in this text. Is that in there? Can you talk about that theme as well?
Very much so. Yeah, I definitely want to think about books as living entities. I think that's also really helpful in coming to understand translation as active collaboration, and also just understanding that, this term original probably doesn't really mean that much. We all know that so many drafts go into creating a novel, for example, and there isn't really a final version. There's the version that you send to your publisher when your publisher says you're out of time, but very few authors, I think, would say like, oh yeah, that's absolutely exactly how it needed to be, and I will never think about that book again. So I like the idea that there are all these different versions, even in the original, of every book, and that it is kind of a living entity that continues to live on in readers, of course. So it's this always interactive process, whether it's with translators, editors, readers, whomever.
My guest today is Jennifer Croft. We're talking about her debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. Jennifer, we are going to dig back into translation and more of the themes that are in your book. We were just talking about the forest and how there's a mirror, right, of that being a living thing that's mirrored on the translation itself. But there's also the darker side, right in the title, of extinction and things that are dying in the forest, right? Dying forever. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, so the title partly refers to Irina Rey's magnum opus, which is what all of the translators have come to the forest to work on, which is called Great Eminence, and it's about extinction and also kind of partly inspired by some trouble that really is happening in the forest in 2017 in real life, where the Polish government has begun to log areas of the national park that were thought to be protected, or at least more protected. And the excuse is that there's a spruce bark beetle infestation, potentially caused by climate change. But a lot of activists and scientists suggest that this is just a pretext, that the government is up to something else. So Irina Rey, who has always lived in the Białowieża forest, is, on the verge of a nervous breakdown when the translators arrive, partly because of these developments. And I think I have been to the Białowieża forest a number of times, and although I am kind of questioning this term original, and so I wonder how useful it is to think of it as an original forest in the sense that there have always been human beings around there as well. it is remarkable and extremely powerful, I think, because it has been largely left alone. There is so much biodiversity there, and it is the last remaining habitat for a lot of different kinds of creatures, plants, animals, fungi. Um, and so it is such a special place, and it would be horrible to have it be lost. And actually, there have been developments since 2017 that have been even more worrying. So that's partly what the extinction in the title is about.
So you use the word habitat as you talk about the forest, and I felt like you created a habitat for translation when the translators all come together in this, house, and they're on the edge of the forest. And they are also transforming. I want to go back again to this transformation theme because I'm a little obsessed with it after reading your book, and I wanted to ask more about it. In the beginning of the book, every translator is known by the language. Serbian, they are French, they are, right? That is their name. But sort of halfway through, they transform, the author goes missing, and they start introducing themselves to one another and start sort of unfolding and telling each other about their lives outside of this habitat, this translating habitat. Can you talk about that transformation of the translators themselves?
Yeah, so they start out referring to each other by their languages because that's kind of the only way in which they're relevant to their author, Irena Rey, who, is such a diva and so unlike anyone I've actually worked with. But I'm sure there are these kind of celebrity authors around. So once she's gone, they gradually realize, some of them sooner than others, that that utility can be kind of put aside in some ways. They're still translating her books, but that is no longer their only function in the household, and they start to share parts of their lives with each other. And I think that's kind of the key turning point in the novel. That's where they were previously, at least the narrator, Emmy, the Spanish translator, believes that they were previously kind of one entity, and now suddenly they begin to break down into multiple entities.
And things turn dark, and they think that maybe someone is trying to kill one of them or all of them. Talk about that dark turn for us.
Yeah, I mean, part of what happens, so they are kind of trapped, or they view themselves as being trapped in this habitat, which I think is a great way to think about Irina's household. They're sort of waiting for her to come back. They've done a little bit of preliminary searching, but they're freaked out by the forest, which is it's an overwhelmingly powerful place, and it can be quite scary, particularly at night, which is when they first go in search of her. And then they are in a village that is quite a particular village that isn't really accustomed to having outsiders. One of the things I was also interested in exploring in this book is the difference between a native species and an invasive species, which is what we talk about when we talk about the forest. And at what point does a visitor become invasive, or at what point does a visitor become a trespasser or an interloper? And so that's something that they're worrying about quite a bit, and they're not getting a lot of positive feedback from the villagers they encounter. And so when they are confronted with an act of violence out in the world, they can't really help but take it personally, and worry that there's some xenophobia, some very violent xenophobia at work.
Well, I mean, as you said that, I'm sitting here wondering, is a translator an interloper?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an open question. Each of the translators in this book approaches their work so differently. We have the narrator who represents kind of one extreme of the spectrum of being as absolutely faithful as possible, no matter what, and no matter what the consequences. And then you have the woman who is translating her book for us into English, who is her arch nemesis, who represents the opposite viewpoint, that the most important thing that you have to do as a translator is entertain the target language reader. So make sure the English language reader is having a good time. And if that means you have to cut a chapter here or there, that's totally fine. That's kind of part of your job. And I also don't know any translators who are that extreme or so extremely faithful, but I wanted to show like the full range of possibilities in this book to help people think about where an author fits into this equation of, interloper, trespasser, invasive, or potentially like someone who is enriching the soil of the ecosystem.
You are an expert, right? I mean, probably one of the best, if not the best translators in the world. And here you are telling us that you don't know translators like the ones that you actually wrote about. So I have to ask you, why did you make them so different from, because I'm reading this thinking, is this what some translators are like? So why would you present them this way?
Well, like I say, they're just extremes. So, of course, like there are many, many translators who want to be as faithful as possible, but they just don't. I mean, this is a very outlandish and very wild novel in which everything is kind of pushed to the extreme, partly because of the setting, again, of this amazing forest, and partly because, I wanted to show this kind of fundamental existential ethical question that will inevitably lead to violence between the translators themselves. So they represent two really important ideas pushed as far as possible.
And I think that you're making a great point that by pushing it so far, you keep me as the reader asking the entire time, what is translation? What is a translator? Right? What am I reading this in this living document next to this living forest? If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jennifer Croft, and we are talking about her debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. Okay, so we're going to go back into this novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey, and we're talking about the extremes. And one extreme that we haven't talked about yet is the lust in the novel. You have 8 translators. They are confined to this house, but there's this forest. It's very sensual. And of course, there is love, there is sex, there is this, right, feeling like I could feel the moss, the dew, all of it. Can you talk about that sensuality in the book?
Yeah, I think that was always something that I wanted to see kind of play out in this plot. I wanted to see rivalries develop between the translators. That was really important, especially kind of rivalries having to do with the power dynamics of their languages. And then I also wanted to see who began to desire whom. And so my narrator kind of immediately falls head over heels for this new translator, the newest translator in their group, who translates into Swedish, which everyone agrees is really important because it's, of course, the language, the native language of the people on the Swedish Academy who determine the Nobel Prize. So she really objectifies him from the very beginning and kind of pursues him in her semi discreet way, while also kind of lusting after her arch nemesis Alexis in a more muted way that she seems not even to be aware of, but that also plays into that enmity because there's some jealousy intermingled with that lust.
So throughout the book, you remind us that this is a translation, that there's a translator present really by using footnotes. And you put little, notes in the footnotes reminding us, oh, the translator thought about this or that, her own sort of musings on the book itself. How did you think about footnotes?
So the book begins with a translator's preface. That's a warning by Alexis, our English translator, that says, like, basically, we shouldn't read this book because it's a dumb book and it's a bad book and it's like a lie. It's all a lie. Hopefully, she insists too much and the reader suspects that there's something else afoot, and does continue reading. And I wanted to sort of continue that input throughout the book. And of course, like, footnotes are a very academic thing, and this is a little bit of a satire of that. Alexis's footnotes are often, really kind of simple retorts to what her nemesis Emmy is saying about what happened or the way that she's saying it. Alexis criticizes Emmy's Polish because she's supposedly written this book in Polish. Emmy criticizes Alexis's Polish. And so as I wrote the book, I kind of started to include more and more footnotes because I love this back and forth between them. I found it really funny and I enjoyed writing it. But also, again, it kind of contributes to this sense of inevitability, I think, with like the ultimate outbreak of violence between them.
But it also gives us this constant question of what is translation and make sure that we're not losing the translator's voice.
That's right. Yeah, it gives us also hopefully a reminder that Alexis is, we think we're being told the story by Emmy, but ultimately Alexis has the final word. She's in charge. She may have cut things. She says at some point that she did cut things. She may have changed a lot about the book to incriminate Emmy or for other purposes. So, yeah, hopefully will remind the reader that they're in the translator's hands.
And this takes us back to where we started, right? Which is whose voice are we reading? Is it the author's voice? Is it the translator's voice? Sort of where does the text fall in that spectrum?
Right, exactly. Somewhere in the middle.
Somewhere in the middle, which is translators on translations, which is just fascinating. If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jennifer Croft, and we are talking about her debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. I want to follow up my questions about extinction and the forest here and talk about climate change, because that's also a big theme in the book. So tell us about climate change.
So it's introduced in the book in a couple of ways. When they arrive in September, they find that Białowieża is extremely unseasonably warm. So it's kind of a Białowieża forest that they've never experienced before. And of course, Irina, living in this part of the world, doesn't have air conditioning, and they're just constantly sort of like trying to peel the sweaty clothes off their skin. And also, there is this question of this spruce bark beetle infestation in the forest, which is maybe causing the government to cut down all of the spruce trees. And that may be because the forest is essentially dehydrated because it's so warm and there's less moisture than usual. And so the trees are unable to defend themselves against insects.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to NHPR. My guest today is Jennifer Croft, and we are talking about her brand new debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. This book is about translators, translations, and really has us thinking about what is a translation and the importance of a book as a living, transforming document. Jennifer herself is one of the best translators, if not the best translators in the world. And I am so excited to have her here today. And we are going to transition now to talking a little bit more about translation and translation in the book, because we have all kinds of questions for her about this idea about translators are being forced to write a book again. And she talks about that in the book. She talks about it in her work. So, Jennifer, can you talk to us about this notion of translators writing a book again?
Yeah, so that phrasing is Alexis's, what she's talking about, how she feels because she is a character in the book that she's translating, she feels like, she's totally misrepresented, and then she is forced, to use her word, to write that misrepresentation all over again. Only now, obviously, with a little bit more control over what's happening. It is kind of writing a book again. That's been my experience of it. I'm certainly so impacted by whatever I'm translating. And I've noticed that a lot of my friends who are translators feel this as well. Like if you're translating a very traumatic plot, that becomes your whole life. That becomes kind of all you think about. And that's where your mind is at all times. And, I hear from writers frequently that their translators are their closest readers. There is like this extremely intimate contact. It may be one directional, which is another thing I wanted to look at in this book, but it really does feel to the translator like they're writing the book again. They're having some of the same experiences that the author had when they were writing the book originally.
So, one directional, what do you mean that a translation may be one directional?
So I was thinking about the phenomenon of parasocial relationships where, like someone might be, let's say, a fan of Taylor Swift and they live and breathe Taylor Swift songs or just Taylor Swift as a person. And she really is like an active part of their life. And she's kind of like a friend or however they may feel about it. But obviously, Taylor Swift, on the other hand, has no idea that this person exists in general. And So there's some of that when you're translating someone, you become so obsessed with them and their work and this work in particular that you're currently laboring over. And they actually may not know of your existence. Like, as my work is translated, I find that it's actually kind of hard to get in touch with my translators. I would love to collaborate with them as much as possible, or just be there to answer any questions they might have, or as a sounding board or whatever. But often the publishers don't seem to really want that. I think they feel like it just isn't that efficient. I'm not sure, but it can be quite hard to have that bi-directional contact, in which case, you have one person who is constantly preoccupied with the other, and the other person who just never thinks about the first person.
Yeah. So in the book itself, we are always reminded that there's a translator who is, has translated the Extinction of Irena Rey. We see that through the footnotes. And you, in your real life, have made a push to put translators' names on the book, right? And it seems like because you sort of feel this, right? This connection with the author and the book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I think that's really important for a variety of reasons. I think it's great to remind people that this book has this other life in a different language. I think, as English speakers in particular, we too often just assume that everything in the world is in English. And so, for instance, Olga Tokarczuk's Flights does not feature my name on the cover. I not only translated the book, but I also spent 10 years trying to sell it to a publisher. So I spent 10 years working really hard to pitch it, to meet with editors, to publish pieces about the book, to publish excerpts from the book. It was obviously really hard work, and I felt just very involved when it finally came out, not only because all of the words on the page were mine, but also because of all of that background work that I think people in general don't know that translators into English do. We kind of do serve as the scout, the agent, the director of publicity and marketing. So we have all of these different roles. So we should be on the cover just for our own sakes, but also, obviously, Olga Tokarczuk, for example, is a very proud Polish writer, and her original language should be valued and respected and acknowledged also. So I think it needs to say translated from Polish by Jennifer Croft, which also signals that this is a different book from Bieguni, the Polish book that Olga wrote, because this one has more people involved and different goals.
That is just fascinating. I never knew that the translator took on that role. I thought, for my own books, much like you, I don't really have any conversations with the translators. It's just a done deal through the publisher.
Right. Yeah, I think it is more common for translators into English to have to do all of that work because it is less common for there to be translations, say literary fiction, whereas in a lot of other languages, it's sort of just taken for granted that a huge proportion of new books will be translated from other languages.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jennifer Croft, and we're talking about her debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. You're listening to Check This Out on New Hampshire Public Radio. All right, we are really digging into translation here and what it means, what the role of a translator is in a novel. And one of the questions that I am dying to ask you, Jennifer, is where does your mind go when you sit down to write a translation? How are you thinking? Is it, sort of word for word? I'm guessing is not how you're thinking. So can you describe it to me?
Yeah, I think it's different for every project. I know it's different translators have completely different ways of working. I I need to be kind of isolated, really similar to how I feel when I'm writing my own work. I just need to immerse myself fully in the fictional world, whether it's a short story or a novella or a novel. And once I get that sense that I'm entirely in that other world, I feel like I then do have that license to just start taking things apart, taking sentences apart, taking pages apart, and then putting them back together. And then, of course, there are many drafts of every translation, and At some point, I compare the original and whatever draft I'm on to make sure that I haven't strayed too far. But in general, I don't feel that I do. I want to make sure that the English language reader can feel the beauty of the text and can fully appreciate all of the impact of the characters and the setting, and be following along with the plot at the same rhythm that the original reader was or is. But there are a number of small alterations that people wouldn't think about, like punctuation, for example, which is just different. The rules for punctuation are different in every language. Or, like the order of words is always really different in the translation. So you have to think about that very carefully. What order do you want to convey the information in? What impact does that have? So a lot of micro decisions that take up quite a lot of time.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Jennifer Croft, and you're listening to Check This Out on NHPR. We are talking about the debut novel, The Extinction of Irena Rey. It is all about translation and translators. My guest, Jennifer Croft, is a translator herself. What do you want people to think about translators after they've read this book?
I just want people to think about translators. I don't have anything in particular that they need to be thinking. I just want people to think about the existence of translators.
And how about translators? When they read this book, what are you hoping they're going to say?
Uh, I hope that some of the material in here, even when it's kind of over the top, I think it's still. I feel like Nana Kwame Adjei-Brenyah has talked about this. Sometimes, like the more outrageous the fiction, the more it kind of strikes a real chord in the reader. Like you sometimes have to exaggerate in order to get people to think about the real thing. And I love his work, and I agree with that. So I hope that translators who are reading these wild adventures, even if they've never experienced anything like this, are able to just kind of reflect on their own practices, and perhaps the practices of their friends who are and colleagues who are also translators, and yeah, just be mindful about the text that they're interacting with in the original as well.
So I understand that you wrote this book in part in seclusion, in a very quiet residency, sort of as a part of nature yourself. Can you talk about that writing process?
I had been thinking about it, and the ideas had kind of been gradually coming together since 2017 when I was in the forest when this logging was happening. And I first learned about amadou and that fungus, Fomus fomentarius. Um, really thinking also a lot about translator communities and collaborations between translators. So in 2020, I got this amazing artist's residency in Switzerland called the Jan Michalski Foundation Residency. And unbelievably, I made it to Switzerland in the fall of 2020. I think I was like not actually allowed to travel through Germany at the time. I was sort of like arrested by the Frankfurt airport police for a little while and
Wow.
held in this like tiny cell. I don't know why they released me, but thankfully they did, and I got to go and live in this just extraordinary little house. They call it a tree house, and mine was somehow like 3 stories overlooking the Alps and Lake Geneva, just stunningly beautiful. And I was able to, as you say, isolate myself almost completely, which enabled me to really inhabit this world. And my friends were the characters in this book, and that was such a luxury. I mean, it was just such a wonderful experience. And then my experience of revising it was essentially the opposite of that, where I was constantly interrupted by various things.
You're talking about this gift of seclusion and this residency. I find also that as an author that just being able to block out everything else, all this noise, is sometimes what we need to actually finish a draft. And it's hard to explain that, right? And what a gift that residency is.
Yeah, I think that's right. It can be, I think, also so overwhelming to go to your first residency as an artist and to be given that incredible gift of space and time. And I love the residencies where they give you at least one meal a day, so you just don't even have to think about that. Like you don't even have to go to the store or think of something that you might want to eat. It's just so incredible to be freed from basically like your whole actual real daily life so that you can create this fictional thing.
And just for people who are listening who might not know, these writer residencies, there are a number of them around the world, and you can apply. And it's literally this gift of time and space and food where writers can come for, 1 week up to a couple of months to just work on their craft, and or artists of any sort of genre can come and work. So it's amazing. Jennifer, what advice do you have for new writers?
Well, go to a residency. That would be one. That's a great. I'm glad you gave that explanation. And just to elaborate on that, a lot of them are totally free to the artists. So I would recommend looking for those that are. Um, there's always the question of MFA programs, Masters of Fine Arts. I think a lot of new artists and writers are wondering if they should do that. I did an MFA in literary translation at the University of Iowa. I felt like it was so helpful just to have the time to develop my craft as a translator. It was really necessary to me as a translator personally. And that was also fully funded experience for 2 years. And also, of course, like since I mentioned I grew up speaking only one language, that was very helpful in offering language training. I learned Polish completely fresh at the University of Iowa when I was doing my MFA. So I think that's something that is absolutely not required and that may not be for everyone. I'm sure it isn't for everyone, but I guess I do just want to say that looking for ways of just writing drafts while not having to worry about a job is probably a good idea if you can, find that opportunity. I think that could be helpful.
It seems like, you've also given a little bit of advice along the way to hang in, right? That getting something to publication is a very long and hard road.
Definitely, yeah, and that's so important to remember because I think it's so easy to get discouraged when you're starting out in particular because like at this point I've been working in this field for such a long time that obviously I am going to get negative reviews or negative feedback from people, but I that is outweighed by all of the positive things that have happened in my career. Whereas when you're starting out, you don't have that to balance out the rejections. But I think it's so important to remember that tenacity is kind of the main ingredient to anyone's artistic career. Like none of this could possibly happen just because you're like discovered in a classroom or wherever, and then you never have to do any work again. I've been doing kind of relentless promotion work for all of my authors for decades now. I apply for things over and over, often before I get offered them fellowships, residencies. I think a lot of people have to apply multiple times, sometimes with the same application if you really believe in it. Sometimes it can be an opportunity to reformulate or even come up with a new project. But if you really feel like it's the project that you want to do, for instance, I got a fellowship for Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob only after applying with the exact same application 3 years in a row. And I was fully confident in that project. I didn't want to change anything about it. But I also recognized that so much of who gets what is determined by the particular composition of the jury or of the committee or the panel in any given year. And that's always different. So you just kind of have to find the right editor. There's definitely an element of luck, but you have to have the perseverance to kind of stick around until that luck happens for you.
To be clear, you can apply 3 times with the same application because the jury, the panelists who are deciding or reading these applications changes every year. So maybe you just have different readers one year from the other. And I love that you're saying if you believe in your project, you just have to keep going because that is the heart of being a writer.
Definitely.
Jennifer Croft, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been such a pleasure speaking to you. I look forward to staying in touch and can't wait to read whatever you write next.
Thank you so much for having me.
You've been listening to Check This Out, a new literary series which is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Howe Library in Hanover, New Hampshire. We dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. Our producers today are Jared Jenish, Megan Coleman, and NHPR's Jessica Hunt. The Howe Library Director is Ruby Simon. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation and the Howe Library Corporation. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.